Welcome back to After the Breach podcast. We're your hosts, Jeff and Sara. We're joined again by Monica, who's basically our third host now. And we are celebrating episode 50 here with our part 2 of our Southern Resident Killer Whale kind of series here. And
sorry, congratulations, 50 episodes.
I know.
That's awesome.
I really didn't know that we would ever get here to episode 50. I kind of figured we'd do 5 and then lose interest.
I was amazed at episode 1.
You guys. Here's to the next 50.
Well,
I like that.
I like that too. You'll probably be here for episode 100.
I hope so.
But anyway, we are kind of circling back to part 2 on our Southern Resident series. And if you listen to the first episode, great. If you haven't, I would probably recommend going back and listening to that one now.
Maybe go back and listen to all 50 or all 49.
Yeah, that works too. But just to give a little recap. So for the last 20 years, Southern resident killer whales have been listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. It was a federal listing, and it was meant to be a turning point, a moment where science, policy, and public will came together to give this population a real chance at recovery. But here we are in 2026, 2 decades later, and the Southern residents are still struggling, and in some ways, they're more vulnerable than ever. So in this 3-part series, we're stepping back to ask some difficult but necessary questions, like how did we get here? What have we actually done in the last 20 years, and what does it cost? And why, despite enormous effort and investment and public will, haven't Southern resident killer whales recovered? This is not about blaming anybody, but it's really just a deep dive into it. So we're not in despair, but we're becoming more conscious of our actions, what we need, and what it's actually going to take. So it's about understanding the reality of SRKW recovery, biologically, politically, emotionally, and what the future may hold if we're serious about giving this unique population a real opportunity at a better future. Thanks for joining us, Monica.
Happy to be here.
As we kind of talked about in part 1, we talked about how the Southern residents got to where we are right now, from an estimated 150 to 200 whales before the capture era, starting in the 1960s, and then a slow recovery that peaked at like 98 whales in 1995. We saw another decline, and that's kind of what led to this federal listing in 2005 with 87 whales remaining. Scientists at that point had identified 3 primary threats: prey limitation, vessel disturbance, and toxins. And we kind of created what we called the 3-legged stool. The expectation was with legal protection, coordinated action, that recovery was possible, but it's not exactly been a straight path. Over the last 20 years, that effort has included new vessel regulations, salmon habitat restoration, contaminant monitoring, and the formation of a high-profile task force. So hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars have been invested. And today we're going to ask, like, what have we actually done in those 20 years and with all that money? And what has it changed? So are you guys ready to dive into this?
Let's do it.
Yeah,
right.
let's do it. It's really complicated and lots of things to talk about that have been done and not done in the last 20 years. So let's start with before the task force, 2008 to 2018. The NOAA recovery plan, which was finalized in 2008. And we will put a link to that recovery plan in the show notes. Probably one of the largest and most stable thing that was funded throughout that first 10-year recovery period was population monitoring and research.
So I think we're pretty comfortable in our understanding of the Southern residents today and what they eat and where they go. But it is very much true that when they were listed as endangered, there were a lot of things that we did not know, including where they spent most of their time in the winter. There were some sporadic sightings from the outer coast, but one of these research priorities was establishing the winter range of these whales as well as their winter diet. We kind of knew they were eating Fraser River Chinook in the Salish Sea in the summer, but what was happening to them over the rest of the year? NOAA funded quite a lot of research focusing on these efforts. It included additional acoustic recorders on the outer coast, winter coastal surveys where they went out actually looking for the whales and then trying to collect prey samples when possible, and then also their satellite tagging program. Quite a few people aren't even aware that Southern resident killer whales were satellite tagged over the course of about 5 years. It was actually only 8 individual males that were tagged between 2012 and 2016. But that data became really important in helping establish the kind of winter ranges of these animals by not just providing incidental sightings, but tracking their movements in some cases over a period of months. And so all of that ultimately fed into the expanding of the critical habitat from their original range inside the Salish Sea to include the outer coastal waters from Washington down to Central California.
And I think you bring up a good point is like at this point in our relationship with the southern residents, like we have a lot of information about them. We have the photogrammetry that's been done and all that. And so people that are like really loving the southern residents but are fairly new to them, like might feel like this is information that we've had forever. And it's relatively new. Like we were filling up holes in our information bank as recently as 2008 and to 2018 and still to this day.
2008, after the recovery plan came out, is really when a lot of this research started. It was the first year that they trialed using scat detection dogs to collect fecal samples from the whales. This was pre-drones, so they actually hired a helicopter to start taking photogrammetry images. And the goals of this type of work was to start doing health assessments on the whales, looking at body condition, looking at hormone levels, potentially diseases and things like that. And to gain more of an insight of, okay, we know they need more prey, but is it at specific times of year? Is it affecting certain whales more than others? And that sort of thing. And this was all really important information to establish. We needed to know more about how they were suffering from the lack of prey. But in my opinion, to some extent, it's shifted a bit from this kind of population level understanding to more individual level health profiles. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, that's starting to look more at like potentially treating individual whales as things come up, which we saw with J50, right?
And I think we can look at individual whales, but it's not going to be a cure-all for the population as a whole. So we get kind of like our blinders on and focus on individual whales and what we can do because it's something maybe we can accomplish, but it's not actually going to bring lasting, meaningful change to the population as a whole. And potentially has some impacts on the population if we were to do that anyway.
I also think it's fair to point out that a lot of the information that we learned, especially early on in that first 10 years, really has changed in terms of their winter patterns. And I don't believe that during that first 10 years, they were spending this much time during the winter months in the inland waters like they are now.
I'm going to push back on that one a little bit.
Okay, I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I think JPOD has been doing this for quite some time, and we see even now with everybody looking for them that they can go undetected for long lengths of time. But some of those initial, satellite tags, we're going back 15 years now, and JPOD was pretty much going between the northern Strait of Georgia and the western end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca in January, February.
Okay, interesting, but not L's and K's.
Outer coast.
Outer coast.
Yeah.
Okay.
So ranging, spending a lot of time like off Gray's Harbor and the mouth of the Columbia River and occasional forays down to Monterey. And that fits with the kind of anecdotal observations we had over the 30 years prior to that. But the dedicated survey efforts that happened between the endangered listing and the Orca Task Force really fleshed that out, those patterns. And I think their winter patterns have probably been pretty consistent.
It's more their summer patterns that have changed.
Exactly. Yeah. After some of this baseline level knowledge was established, more details of their diet, their travel patterns, that sort of thing. Another thing that came out of this kind of initial push of research funding was a threat analysis, looking at interactions between different risk factors. So there was a 2012 paper that compared the so-called inadequate prey hypothesis to the vessel traffic hypothesis. So looking at fecal hormones and, stress hormones and are they higher when vessel traffic is high or when food is low? So really highlighting the importance of prey as kind of one of the primary risk factors. And then you get a little bit later on, and they're doing population viability analyses. There was a famous, the 2017 paper that said, oh, if we reduce noise by this much and increase salmon by this much, they're likely to recover. And so some of the modeling informed by that early research has become a little bit more advanced and really highlighted how these risk factors kind of compound each other. And so I think what we really learned from a lot of this research is that it is more complicated than they're starving to death. And, I absolutely think prey availability, the quantity and quality of it is the kind of the crux of the issue for them. But there's a lot of other things going on, from, genetic inbreeding to potentially underlying health conditions, just the social structure and how they rely on each other, that if a male loses mom, he's then more vulnerable. Like, we have all these new insights from that research where we know so much more than we did 20 years ago. And so I think in that aspect of the initial recovery plan of like, these are our data gaps, this is what we need to know, it's been incredibly successful in that regard, that we've learned a lot of the things that we need to know, but doing those investigations on their own is not going to save them, right?
Right.
In your opinion, would you say, with everything that we've learned and all the different factors that intertwine together, there's not just one factor, there's all these factors, would you still say that prey quality and quantity is still the primary driver that we're dealing with?
Definitely. Everything else that's going on is, made worse by the lack of prey. If there's too much noise in the water, they're going to have less success finding the prey that's there. If there's a lot more food, the noise is going to be less of a factor. We see that with big killer whales here in the Salish Sea. Similarly with the toxins, if they're carrying the toxins, it's not as bad as when they start metabolizing the toxins, and they metabolize the toxins when they're food limited. Similarly, if they have an underlying health condition, they're probably more susceptible to those when they're not robust and not getting enough food. And so it really does come back to prey, I think, as the key issue. But like I said, it's more complex than they're starving. A lot of times, when we lose a whale, people are asking, well, did they not get enough food? Why didn't they get enough food? And they probably didn't, but there's a lot of other factors, contributing to that. We can't say very often what the specific cause of death is for a particular whale. And we see that we lose certain individuals when their family members are looking well. So it's more complicated than just food alone, but I think it's very clear from the science that food is the most important.
And I do feel like the word starving evokes a bigger emotional response than what I usually tell people when I'm talking to them about Southern residents, is that it's more like you're chronically nutritionally stressed. Like you're chronically just lacking in nutrition. And we know how that impacts the human body and likely has a similar effect on other animals when you're just not getting enough to eat. Yeah, you might get a little bit, but you're not getting enough to eat, and how that impacts it. But it doesn't have the same kind of emotional response as these whales are starving to death.
Definitely. And that plays out, for example, in the number of lost pregnancies. Another thing we've learned in the last couple of decades is they are successfully getting pregnant. Most of our breeding females have been observed with pregnancies, fairly often, but they're losing them often late stage. And that is linked to the nutritional status of the mom. So again, very varying factors at play, but all kind of leading back to, if they had more abundant prey, a lot of these other issues would be having less of an impact on them at the population level.
So one of the other things that came out of that first decade were the first vessel regulations. Prior to that, there were no federal regulations on approach distances to southern resident killer whales. There were guidelines, right? There were guidelines from the Marine Mammal Protection Act.
So yeah, it was for decades a 100-yard guideline for viewing southern resident killer whales. And let's be honest, it was a little bit of the Wild West out here at times. There were definitely, leapfrogging was a thing, vessels parking in the path of the whales. It was chaotic sometimes. And so I think rightfully so, one of the first things we realized that we could do is put some regulations in place to, control this a little bit and get a handle on, what in the late 1990s was a very, very bustling waterway, here in the Salish Sea.
I mean, you probably remember, I know I remember coming out here in the mid 90s to early 2000s, peak of summer, like hundreds of fishing vessels, like recreational fishing vessels, but also like commercial fishing vessels off the west side, boats watching whales. And it was like crazy. So it's funny to me, like some of the newer guides out here now are like, man, it was really busy. There were like 10 boats out there. And I'm like, ooh, I want to like show them a video of, the mid 90s to 2000s because it was chaos.
It's hard to find photos or videos from that time. That was before my time, but I would love to see what that looked like.
I should have asked Bob Otis, who did research out at Limekiln starting in the 1990s, because he did periodic vessel surveys throughout the day, going back. And there were vessel counts from the 90s where from Limekiln, you could see more than 120 vessels.
Wow. Of all different types.
Yes.
Yeah. And you would just see like the nets would be set out from the commercial fishermen. And Monica, I'm sure you saw this, but I remember this vividly of the whales just kind of like skirting around the edges of the nets and like weaving in between all of this chaos. And it was chaotic. So yeah, definitely like a very different scene now to then, but something important for us to always be like looking at our potential impact.
Sure.
Good
so
or bad.
Something needed to be done. Something was done.
Yeah.
2009 was that rulemaking process, and I believe they were implemented in 2011.
Correct.
It became within Washington's inland waters, 200-yard mandatory viewing distance for killer whales.
Which is kind of interesting to me that it's a federal rule. It's a federal regulation that only applies to the inland waters in Washington state for a population that travels, outside of the inland waters. But
at this time, that hadn't been well established yet.
Right.
What we knew at that time was they're here all summer in the Salish Sea, and that's where the intersection was happening. I think now it's very interesting that that's still the case. But at the time, maybe it made sense.
And I could be wrong, but I can't think of another example of specific regulations on a species or population
North Atlantic right
that
whales.
only applies in certain areas.
St. Lawrence belugas.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, there you go. You can edit that out. This also, during this period, we had an increase in grants to the state of Washington to enforce the regulations. And we also had continuing study on potential vessel impacts.
It is important to note, though, I think, that a lot of the studies on vessel impacts on resident killer whales preceded those 2011 vessel regulations going into place.
Correct.
So there's a body of research that gets cited still today that's based on kind of that, what I call the Wild West era, where there was, 100-yard guideline and that was it. And certain things were, behavioral changes and shifts in behavior and that sort of thing were documented in that era. And personally, I don't think we've studied how the whales behave under those interim regulations that we've had before proceeding to make them more strict.
Yep, I agree.
And I think that's something we touched on a little bit on part one. And just this framework of how peer-reviewed science and quote unquote the best available science works is that you have early studies that are always cited in later studies, but nowhere is it factored into changing conditions and how the conclusions of the early studies may not be applicable to situations that have changed. So it would be interesting because one of the studies that came out during this period of time with potential vessel impacts was, and we can post a link to this study in the show notes, and this came from actual data of putting suction cup tags recording ambient sound that the whales were actually receiving. And the conclusion of the study is that the primary driver of the sound that reaches the whales is vessel speed. And that outweighed anything else with the vessels. It wasn't proximity, it was speed that was the main driver. And that launched the basis for guidelines and then further regulations on vessel speed within a certain proximity.
So I'm glad you brought that up because those suction cup tags called D tags are one of the vessel disturbance research, strategies that has happened since those vessel regulations. They started deploying those in 2009 and, continued pretty consistently to 2014. And there's a series of important papers that have come out as a result of that data showing, like you said, received sound levels, some details on killer whale foraging and things like that. So there has been some additional research since those initial regulations were put into place, but that data set now, we're looking at, again, over a decade old. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think you're right. We talked on the last episode about vessels being the so-called low-hanging fruit. But some things were done over that first decade or so on the prey and toxin front as well.
Yes, there was definitely an increase in funding for hatcheries and culvert replacements and different watershed projects. There was definitely more attention being given to broader salmon recovery. As far as I can see in the research that we did for this podcast, there wasn't anything new that was created in terms of salmon recovery. It was increasing funding to programs that already existed, but nothing new was implemented. And this was for broader salmon recovery, nothing specifically targeted to salmon recovery that would impact southern residents in the fastest amount of time.
And I think that brings up an important point with this too, is like we were funding existing programs for salmon recovery, and a lot of these funds were very, fragmented. So they went to different agencies, to different organizations and state programs with this goal of like broader salmon recovery. But it's hard to kind of track where things went and how it was used and what's the net return for southern residents.
So many of the salmon stocks on the West Coast were listed as endangered in the 1990s. So this timing was like alongside this push for salmon recovery, not just for killer whales, but for other broader push, for having wild salmon persist on the West Coast. And so the funds that went to some of these programs, if they were motivated by the killer whale front, these were important things to fund. Like this is not like it was a waste of money. Yeah. But I think there was kind of an acknowledgement after a decade or so that we're not quite seeing the return on the investment for the killer whales that maybe we had hoped after they'd been on the endangered species list for over 10 years.
Right. There was no central coordinated plan of salmon recovery. It was what was fragmented prior to the recovery plan. And then these programs just got additional funding and maybe some additional emphasis. But like you said, Sarah, looking into it, it's very fragmented, different federal agencies, different grants to the states and organizations to distribute it to different projects. It's really hard to track. And there was nothing really new that was created in the recovery plan. It was just funding this very complex and very fragmented framework.
And to be clear, what Monica said, like salmon recovery in and of itself is important and worthy of investment. So I'm Absolutely. I'm not like saying, oh, we shouldn't have invested the money because it didn't impact the whales. Like we should, because it impacts salmon and hopefully will improve that. It just drove home the fact for me, and I think you both could agree that there were so many talks that we attended from, NOAA killer whale people, and we would ask a question about salmon, in relation to southern residents, and they would be like, oh, that's a totally different NOAA office and we don't do anything with salmon.
Yeah, it was very hard to get information on what was actually being done.
And one of the few southern resident focused things that happened in that era was there was a series of workshops and eventually a science panel that was assessing the impact of fisheries on southern resident killer whales, came to, in my opinion, some kind of dubious conclusions that maybe set back some of these efforts at the time. But you're absolutely right. There was not a lot of southern resident targeted salmon recovery that happened. There was more some much needed support for some existing efforts that were starting to get off the ground.
And this goes beyond, I know there are a lot of people that talk about needing to set aside an allocation of salmon for the southern residents that aren't accounted for fisheries, whether that's commercial or recreational. We're talking about something completely different from that. We're talking about what areas to focus on that are specifically targeted for southern residents, what salmon runs, what rivers, what projects would actually have the fastest impact on the fish that they're actually searching for. And there was no centralized plan for that.
And we now have a lot more data to inform things like that because of the diet studies that have happened where NOAA released, the priority Chinook stocks for southern residents, showing which river systems are they relying on year round most significantly. And so again, we've done some of the key legwork in identifying what we need to know to be able to do some of those things. But what are we going to do with that information is the question.
So we must have a plan for that now. So moving on after this first 10 years or so, during that period of time, everything was fragmented, but there were estimated hundreds of millions to billions of dollars were spent in that first decade or so for different programs with toxins, potential vessel impacts, and prey recovery.
But there were rumblings politically, publicly about we're not doing enough. And I think that led to Governor Inslee of Washington State having this idea to put together an ORCA task force to really do a deep dive into what can Washington State, at least at the state level, so that limits the scope, but within state agencies, what could Washington do to turn this around for the southern residents?
So there was political rumblings and public push prior to 2018 that we weren't doing enough because we were still declining at that point, I believe, in terms of the numbers of southern resident killer whales.
Yeah, so there were 87 southern residents at the time of their listing in 2005, and by 2018, we were down to 75. So continued population decline after being listed as endangered.
But I think the real catalyst for the formation of the task force and the real flashpoint was J35.
Well, that unfolded as the task force was going on. And so I think that changed the conversation, but I wouldn't say that's why it happened.
No, but it definitely, I think, created more urgency around the task force to take what the task force was saying is that they were going to be taking bold action.
So, Jeff, you were on the ORCA task force.
Yes.
Tell us, what was it? Who was on it? And kind of what was your mandate?
So there were about 50 different stakeholders and science panels to advise the stakeholders. Stakeholders represented different agencies, different industries, commercial fishing, shipping, professional whale watching, NGOs, elected officials. And then there were science advisors also on the task force and in working groups. There were different working groups for potential vessel impacts, prey availability, toxins. And Monica, were you on one of the work groups?
I was not.
Okay. But I did see you at the
I
meetings.
was at every meeting, yes.
Yeah.
So this, to me, is where things got off on the wrong foot. That they put the stakeholders in charge and had the scientists on the outside, either informing via work groups or, for some of us, limited to giving input in 60 to 120 second public comments. I was just going to say, by my count, I think there were 2 scientists on the task force out of almost 50 people.
Who are you counting on the...
Ken Balcom and Joe Gatos.
Yeah. And I think that what you're saying is so accurate that this is what culminated in Ken Balcom not even showing up for the most important final meeting to approve the recommendations, because I think he was just fed up with what was going on.
And having followed the process closely from start to finish, it is the most front row seat that I have ever had of politics. And unfortunately, kind of the dirty side of politics, where you could see backdoor deals being made. You could see the established protocols of the task force not being followed. And it became more of a political game than it did what was best for the whales.
Absolutely. From my point of view, I was so excited to be on the task force. When I got the notification that I was going to be on there, I was so excited and felt so empowered that I would be able to do something for southern residents. I felt like probably one of the top stakeholders that had the southern resident interests in my mind and in my heart. I know obviously Ken Balcom as well, but I wasn't there to protect whale watching. I was there to help southern residents, and I was so excited, and I was so disheartened by the end. And to this day, I still have some PTSD from it. There is an element, and it's really unfortunate, but there is an aspect to Southern residents that triggers stress for me because of the task force and what came out of it, how I was treated during it, how I was personally attacked in some public comments, and how the task force allowed that to happen, that I don't think anybody else would have been personally attacked in public comment and allowed for those public comments to continue and to be there. But most importantly, I was disappointed at the end of how political it was and how the things that came out of it were largely political and not in the best interest of the whales.
But let's back up a little bit, because
Yes.
it was a bit of a fiasco, but it wasn't, useless. It was an exciting thing to be a part of, because this was like dozens of people coming together, acknowledging the problem and looking for solutions, at least at the beginning. And there were kind of different goals of things that they thought should be addressed. It included, the 3 legs of the stool and all of that. But I feel like early on, there was more hope and excitement around the process when it was in the phase of throwing out ideas of what might be possible.
No question about it. There was a ton of optimism, and there were a lot of good ideas being talked about.
And then once it came time to start putting those ideas into recommendations, I think that's when the politics came into play, where people who are on the task force were trying to, in many cases, protect their own interests, whether it be fishing or shipping or what have you.
Snake River.
Yeah, I want to come back to that one. But because the stakeholders were the so-called decision makers making the recommendations, it's not surprising, that they were protecting their own and looking to point the finger elsewhere. There was a lot of finger pointing.
And keep in mind that the theme of this whole thing was supposed to be bold action. We're going to take bold actions to do something here to help Southern residents.
One of the biggest and the best things, in my opinion, that came out of the task force was at the beginning, there was no discussion of the lower Snake River dams happening. But the public, first dozens and then hundreds of people started showing up to these meetings. And I kept track at a couple of the meetings, and it was like 90% of the commenters mentioned the lower Snake River dams. And this is one of those cases where we actually saw public comment shift the conversation, where it was so much and the media was picking it up and putting it on the news. We had the petition with however many 100,000 signatures of people wanting the dams breached and everything, where Jay Inslee, through his, deputy director of communications, actually issued a statement directing the task force to put lower Snake River dams on the table.
Yeah, the public comment, I was there for every meeting, and they were largely skewed towards Snake River dams and prey availability. That was definitely the biggest topic, I think, there.
And I think it's just a great reminder, too, of like the public will is not without power, right? When we get going and I think make our voices heard.
You're absolutely. I think it's beyond that. It's essential.
Oh, absolutely. I think a lot of people feel like, oh, I could say something, but it's not going to make a difference. But this is a prime example of how it made a difference.
I think it's what makes the difference. There were a lot of people that came out for public comment that on most meetings, not everybody got to speak. But I think it wasn't yet critical mass enough to alter the outcome of the task force.
So I guess what I'm saying is say the thing.
Say it.
Well, and then there's always nuance, right? Like the state of Washington can't breach the lower Snake River dams. It's, they're federal dams. So the task force did not have the power to breach the dams. But one of the things that did come out of the task force was the, establishment of another stakeholder panel focused on the dams, but looking at, if in the event the dams are breached at some point, what sort of mitigation is needed at the state level, and laying some of the groundwork for that. So it's not what people wanted. The dams are still there, but it moved the needle. And I think it changed the conversation around the political will in the state towards having those conversations.
And I think we do have to look at, we want everything to happen quickly, and in a perfect world it would. But even the Elwha River, the dam removal process and going to court, and that took 60 years? And I'm not saying that we should wait 60 years, but there's a lot of movement on this, and It just takes time.
It does. We need more critical mass on that issue for sure.
So even with all the wheeling and dealing and the paring down of kind of the bold on the action that were, the actions that were proposed, the task force resulted in 49 recommendations, many of them very good recommendations. So that was, 2018, 2019. Here we have the 49 recommendations from the task force. Then what?
Yeah, where are we with those 49 recommendations? So here's one of the problems with the 49 recommendations, not the recommendations themselves, but how success is being tracked is not being tracked the outcome of the recommendations. It's, have rules been adopted, have things been funded, but not are they successful?
Yeah, are they doing the thing?
Right.
Yeah.
That's not being measured.
So there is a website dedicated to the Orca Task Force, which we should also put a link.
Orca.wa.gov.
Yes, we should put that up because there's a lot of information there. But if you scroll through, so 49 recommendations, 40 of them are listed as either underway or pending. Okay, so some action has been taken, but we're now 8 years removed from the task force. Some of these are long-term, but 40 of them are considered underway. Mm-hmm. Only 6 are listed as complete. It includes the Lower Snake River Dam stakeholder panel. It includes the Go Slow bubble that you alluded to, Jeff, and Commercial Whale Watch licensing program. And then a couple related to kind of permitting and funding and enforcing wastewater and stormwater treatment. So a couple considered complete. 2 are considered inactive, the wreck boater endorsement that was talked about and the suspension of viewing of southern resident killer whales. I don't know that I would call that one inactive, but that's another conversation. But most telling to me when I scrolled through that whole list of 49 is one is listed as needs improvement. And it's the one that says, let's monitor the progress of implementation of the task force.
That's interesting.
So the last progress report on the overall status of the Orca Task Force recommendations was in 2021, so 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I do want to say I'm very proud of the slow speed bubble around southern residents.
Yes.
When that was first put forward, it was quarter mile, and I was adamant that it had to be half a mile because that's what the science said. And that was one of my prouder moments participating in the task force.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's definitely one of the wins. So in kind of the next bigger legislative session that followed the task force, there were 4 important bills that passed. That was one of them, establishing that slow go zone. There were also some related to like removing invasive fish species, expanding safeguards for vessels carrying crude oil, and regulating, chemicals that are harmful to orcas. And again, these are all important and these are all good, but none of these is going to be a game changer, I would say, for the southern residents. They're, in many cases, also, like you said, efforts that were being pushed for already, and it was the killer whale spin on it that helped push these over the finish line.
Mm-hmm. So no bold action.
Maybe italic.
It's tough because these were important things, and these were things that people had been fighting for a while to happen. And I think
it's good that it happened.
In some arenas, it is bold that we move forward on these, but it wasn't bold enough for the southern residents, if that was the biggest thing that came out of this.
Right.
One of the biggest fights in the task force, maybe not fight, but political, I will say underhanded, were the vessel regulations that came out, because the vessel regulations that came out of the task force had not really been discussed during the majority of the task force meetings.
Yeah, this was one of the cases where the task force protocols weren't followed, right? There was a limit as to when like new actions could be introduced, but there was kind of a coalition that formed that accepted the introduction of this last minute new recommendation
on the afternoon of the last meeting.
Yeah, and then had already all agreed to vote for it without discussion. It was, I have PTSD. Yeah. It doesn't even affect me directly, but watching it was infuriating.
And then shortly afterward, that got dialed back a little bit to a very complex and convoluted system of how you could view southern residents. There were certain hours of the day that it was okay, and the distance got pushed back to 300 yards from the 2011 200 yards, but there were only certain times of day that applied.
And only to commercial boats. Like, let's be clear, this
Right.
was not about all boats out there. This was specifically whale watching boats.
Right, pushing just whale watching vessels further back than private boats
Correct.
in the vicinity of southern residents.
Who, one, paid for a license to operate. Let's be clear. We paid to, be back a certain distance, and recreational boaters who don't have to pay for a license.
And also you couldn't go in certain areas, like a certain distance off the west side of San Juan Island.
Obviously, we all have PTSD, so...
So
but the rules were so convoluted that I'm not even, I was thinking count on one hand. I'm not even sure if there's one person who could fully explain those rules without having to look at the law.
Absolutely. It was really complicated. And this is a question I've asked many people over the years, and I'll put it out there. And if you can find an example of this, send us an email. But I found it fascinating that the rules that came out of this. So if you're going to run whale watching tours in Washington State, you are required to get a license.
Not even a whale watching tours.
If you're going to view marine mammals.
Marine mammals.
So just if you're
on a
running,
tour. So harbor tour. If you look at harbor seals.
Yeah. If you're going to look at harbor
you.
seals on a fishing tour, you are required to have a license. So you're obligated to buy the license. And under the terms of that license, your rights are restricted to less than what somebody in the general public can do without a license.
Correct.
And I can't think of another example of any kind where
you pay to be restricted.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to be clear, for those of you that don't know, I'm just going to give a quick example because you might be going like, okay, well, like how stupid could these regulations possibly be? So let me just give you a quick example because I do this on the boat quite a bit. So when these regulations rolled out, it did not apply to recreational boaters, private boaters who could go to 300 yards at any time of year, any time of day. Commercial whale watching vessels that paid for a license, any tour that paid for a license, could watch southern residents at 300 yards between 10 a.m. and noon and between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. As long as you hadn't watched southern residents in the other time slot that day, and you weren't within half a mile of a group containing a whale that was deemed vulnerable, and that group of whales was not within a mile of another group that contained a vulnerable whale.
Or a calf under the age of 2.
Under the age of 2.
And only 3 boats.
And 3 boats at a time.
So if it's 4:00 and the window is open and I'm out there, I have to find out if any of the other boats in our company were out at noon, because then I can't go. Yeah. And then to be within a mile of one whale that's vulnerable. And these are endangered killer whales. Are they not all vulnerable?
And I'd like to think that I'm good at IDing whales, but even at a mile, I can't tell you reliably what individuals are present in a group.
So we could have a whole episode on this. And those rules are no longer in place.
No, it's 1,000 yards for everybody now.
For everybody now. But this wasn't something that was talked about at all during, I don't remember how long the task force went on, but months of all of the discussions.
Well, the recommendation that passed at the last meeting was no viewing of southern residents by commercial whale watching. Right. And that ended up altering in the legal process to that convoluted viewing hour system.
Right, because not viewing isn't really legally, how do you legally enforce? What does that mean, not viewing? Well, we were 200 yards, but we were looking on the other side of the boat. Like, what is not viewing?
I closed my eyes.
Is it a half a mile? Is it a mile?
Yeah.
Right? You can't say no viewing and legally enforce that. If the boat's at half a mile, you're not really viewing because they're far. But
anyway,
yeah, we could do a whole episode. But
so
go.
Following all these recommendations, and that one obviously hit home close to you all with what you do. But the conclusion of the task force, Governor Inslee famously kind of came forward with his proposed $1 billion for orcas, right? $1.1 billion in the state budget that's going to fund everything the Orca Task Force said and turn things around for southern resident killer whales. People who lived in the state at the time, like, I don't think you could have missed that headline.
Right.
But where did that money go?
Where did that money go? $1.1 billion.
So again, it was spread over multiple agencies, multiple organizations. I think a large part of it went to replacing culverts, working with stormwater and fish passage in the state, which was, something that the state was already kind of like legally obligated to do. But, it had to happen regardless of the task force. But that's where I think a lot of the money went.
Well, and similarly to the 2008 to 2018, this $1.1 billion over 4 years wasn't in this centralized southern resident killer whale recovery budget. This money went to a lot of different agencies, different programs. Within agencies, it went into different budgets within those agencies. So to really track where the money went, you need a serious deep dive into forensic accounting to look at multi-year agency, department, NGO budgets to see actually how much of it was actually spent on what.
And again, not that it's not important for the money to get spent in the areas that it did. Just we don't have a way to track how much of it actually improved things for the southern residents.
And you're correct, Sarah. The largest percent of the 1.1 billion went to repair or replace culverts in Washington State, which is an important thing to do for broader salmon recovery. But this was also something that, because of a 2013 Supreme Court decision, Washington State was legally obligated to do this work by 2030 and pay for it. And a lot of the funding for that got passed under the political banner of southern resident killer whale recovery.
And they're tied together, right? Fish passage is key. And this was something, the state was already required to pay for, but this, again, pushed those funds, into place, and they were approved well before 2030 and all of that. What's frustrating, I think, is the way the agencies are structured, the way the state has to manage money, things were going to be fragmented in this sense, but there's no central accounting for what was actually approved in the end, where things went. You have to do a very, very deep dive on the state websites to suss some of these things out. And so if you want to know, well, what did we spend that, famous $1 billion on? You can't go just look that up. So that's one piece of it, is sort of the lack of central accounting. And then I think the other piece of it, the most critical piece of it is, did it do anything? Did we actually spend that money on those things? Are they done? Do they need more money? What's the status? So on the task force website, you can click on each recommendation and see some updates on, $250,000 was approved for this in 2021 and so on. But many of those updates have kind of fallen off, and it's not clear if that means nothing further has happened, or are we not tracking it anymore. And so overall, it just feels like the momentum has faded. And, we're in a now cut budgets, and, some of these important programs are losing money now. So I don't want to say that nothing good happened, because a lot of good things for the environment came out of that $1 billion, including, a lot of things that people had been fighting for quite some time, with toxin monitoring and all of that. So it provided, much needed additional support for a lot of existing programs. But where was the bold new action, and where did that get us now 8 years on?
So I want to make two comments on what you just said. First of all,
you have 60 seconds. I'm just kidding.
First of all, that might not be a bad idea.
That's the Orca Task Force public comment period.
That's what I was going for.
So the first thing is, you're absolutely right. A lot of the funding and a lot of the actions, this is very similar to shades of 2008 to 2018. This was under the political push and the political will of southern resident killer whale recovery. This was adding additional new funding to existing programs and what was already being done, going back in some cases probably to the 1990s for just general salmon recovery. But this was a new way to add more funding to it. There was no new central budget, central command, central plan,
or central oversight,
or
really.
Central oversight for any of this. This isn't the right term. The money grab is not the right term, but this was basically adding a lot more push and emphasis and funding to things that were already going on.
That we honestly should have been funding.
Anyway, right?
Yeah.
Like my tone and what I'm saying should not be misconstrued as this was wasted, because this is all important stuff. But this wasn't bold action, and this wasn't really targeted as we need to do more for Southern residents. That's not what this was. The second comment I have is, you're talking about kind of this oversight waning political will. I think one of the most visible things that came out of the task force was the vessel changes, particularly with professional whale watching. It was very visible. It was very in the media. It was very talked about by the governor and elected officials, and in many ways represented what they were thinking was bold action, because it was very politically visible and tangible. And I think it has done a disservice to the Southern residents, not in terms of not viewing them. I mean, we've talked about this on the podcast. We see killer whales on over 90% of our tours. It's all big killer whales. This isn't about like my self-interest. This is about the interest of the Southern residents. Where I think this has harmed them is that it has further driven in the public mind that if we just get rid of the whale watching boats or the private recreational boats, the Southern residents will be fine. And you see it all over social media, that people are far more focused still we're not even viewing Southern residents anymore, but the public is still so focused on vessel impacts at the detriment of salmon recovery. And I wouldn't even just say the general public. I would say there are NGOs that are still fundraising and focused on vessel impacts at the expense of the primary driver. And I think we've actually done a lot on vessels.
I would say like the wrong vessel, not the wrong vessels, but like we've done a lot about whale watching, and there are vessels we can talk more about, slowdown of big ships, expansion of the coal terminal. I know that's not within our border, but both salmon and Southern residents don't recognize human borders, right? So like we know like ferries are very loud, and so it is still something to discuss. But yeah, the vessel impacts, I think really like the focus has been just on whale watching boats.
Well, I do want to give a shout out to both the ECHO program at the Port of Vancouver and the Quiet Sound program in Puget Sound that are focused on voluntary large ship slowdowns and have had incredible buy-in from the industry.
Absolutely.
So there certainly have been conversations on commercial shipping as well, and important conversations across the board, but we can't do that and call it a win without doing the other harder work that maybe doesn't function as well on a political cycle. I think a lot of the elected officials involved wanted to point to something very concrete that they had accomplished during that term in office that kind of, followed the task force and, get reelected and move on to the next thing that they're being lobbied to do, rather than sticking with this bold action for Southern residents over the course of the decades that it's going to take.
And this is where the public comment, the public will, the public push needs to come back into play to say, hey, we need to follow up on this and do more for these other areas and do more for the Lower Snake River dams and more for salmon recovery and more for not just salmon abundance, but larger salmon. How do we get larger salmon back into the Columbia River and the Fraser River and other rivers?
So in 2018, the time of the Orca Task Force, there were 75 Southern resident killer whales. 2025, the official census from the Center for Whale Research, 74 Southern resident killer whales. So we have not turned the corner, clearly, for what these whales need. So I think this kind of sets us up for where we're heading in the next episode, which is what are some of the big actions that have been taken that maybe were not under the purview of the Orca Task Force or of NOAA or these other agencies that have been pushing for Southern resident killer whale recovery. Where have some of these big ticket items happened? And what else can we do in the next 10 years to make sure we're not looking at a further decline in the population?
Right.
Yeah, and that this is all stuff we're going to talk about in part 3. What do we need to do from here? Because obviously, based on everything we talked about today, this isn't working. 20 years endangered isn't working.
But it's
Not well enough.
yes, it hasn't been a total failure. We're armed with so much more knowledge now that I want to emphasize, like, it's not like we couldn't do it in 20 years. It's hopeless, right?
Right.
We have so much more information of what needs to be done.
Am I coming across as doom and gloom here?
A little bit.
It's not about despair, Jeff.
It's not. And I'm not.
I mean, maybe not doom and gloom, maybe frustrated, which is fair.
Yes. I'm frustrated that we are where we are after 20 years of increased knowledge, the amount that has been of money, of taxpayer money. This is our money that is being spent. It's all good stuff that not all, but a lot of stuff has been funded that is important stuff, but it's not doing for the Southern residents what we need to be doing. And that's where my frustration is coming from.
I totally agree. We have not done enough by these whales, but I've been in the trenches with the scientists and the advocates and the NGOs and everybody who has been fighting so hard for these whales over the last 20 years. And maybe it's me looking for the silver lining, but I want to believe that we have created the framework and the base of knowledge that we need to go forward and do what we actually need to accomplish.
Yeah.
Well, I will ride your optimism and continue with my belief that we owe these whales more than what we've done. They've given back to us way more than what we're trying to give back to them. And we owe them so much more and so much better.
Yeah, let's do right by them. And how do we do that?
All right, let's talk about that in part 3. And I do want to point out the miracle of episode 50 is that we actually did this in an hour.
Because the three of us usually run over an hour.
Exactly. I thought for sure this was going to go an hour and a half too.
I kept checking the clock, I'll be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Thank you guys so much for being with us, whether you joined us just recently or you've been here for all 50 episodes. We really appreciate it.
we do appreciate it. Reach out to us at afterthebreachpodcast@gmail.com with any comments, questions, feedback. Leave us some reviews. We are looking forward to the next episodes, and our whale watching season is here, even though we've been going out all winter, but we are going to be going out daily starting the next couple weeks. Come on out with us, and remember,
Stay safe out there.